Great. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Vahid and Ethics in Tech for having me here, and the fellow panelists, and everyone who's listening in here. It's a real honor and a pleasure. I will be talking about the threat to our digital rights posed by the COVID crisis. We, of course, are in extraordinary times with a raging pandemic, which is a great threat to all of our lives and health and our economic and emotional well-being. At EFF, we view it as our mission to make sure that as we try to come out of this crisis, we do the least possible damage to our privacy and other digital rights. We live in a time where governments and corporations are demanding all kinds of new surveillance powers in order to meet the public health crisis. But when we scratch under the surface, many of them are the same old plans and invasions of privacy that we've seen governments and corporations seeking for a very long time. So there are several of our liberties that are in play here. Privacy, of course, we already are greatly under scrutiny and through all of our interactions with technologies, and governments and corporations have become expert at mining that. It's a threat to our First Amendment rights to assemble and protest because people are chilled from participating when they fear this surveillance. It's a threat to racial justice because the more that we focus on these apparent quick fix technologies, the less attention and resources we have to meet the needs of the people of color who are tragically being left behind in public response to this public health crisis. So when we hear any proposals of new technologies of surveillance in this time of COVID, we ask three questions. The first is, will it even work? And many times it won't, in which case we just oppose the technology. Our second question is whether or not, even if it works, it would be too intrusive on our liberties. So just for example, we have opposed NSA mass surveillance of the internet for almost 2 decades. Even if it might rarely be effective in breaking up a terrorist ring, its impact on our liberties is simply too great. And number 3, when a technology might be effective and is not too burdensome on our liberties to be considered at all, we ask whether there are sufficient safeguards, including consent, data minimization, anti-discrimination rules, and insurance that the program will end with the COVID crisis. And we approach this against a backdrop where over time, in times of crisis, government seizes powers, and when the crisis abates, government keeps the powers. And we have to make sure that that is not true here in the time of COVID. Before I turn to particular kinds of technological proposals that EFF has been struggling with, as we all have in the last 3 months, I want to emphasize that this is not a case of public health versus our rights, because when government adopts public health responses that are too burdensome and intrusive of our rights, it actually is dangerous to our public health. Studies show that when the public does not trust the government, that the public does not comply with suggestions from the government to meet the crisis, that people are more likely to socially distance and to wear masks and to do the other things the government is recommending when the government is seen as trustworthy. So for example, in the AIDS crisis a generation ago, the criminalization of transmission of HIV had the unintended consequence of discouraging some people from getting testing. And so we want to make sure that government takes an approach that is not too heavy-handed. So number 1, there are a lot of proposals afoot to surveil the entire public and try to identify individuals who should not be out and about, either because they are known infected persons or because they are symptomatic. And we think this is a very bad idea, both because the technology is completely unproven and deploying it will just put new hardware in place that's hard to roll back when the crisis is over, and also because it is another step forward towards permanent government surveillance of all of our movements. So for example, there are proposals to put more cameras in place to do face recognition of passersby to identify patients, proposals in place to do remote body temperature checking to identify people who are feverish, proposals to put all of this on drones and have the eye in the sky that is looking for faces and looking for people with elevated temperature. This is all a very bad idea, and we oppose it. Number two, there are proposals to do electronic surveillance of patients who are known by the government to be infected and have been told to stay home and separate from others. Proposals to enforce this by electronic means. We're seeing in foreign countries that people are being forced to download apps onto their phones, which turn their phones into location tracking tools, so that if they step with their phone out of their home, a button beeps at the police department and they send officers out. We're seeing in foreign countries, people are made to wear GPS ankle shackles in order to stay in their home. In some countries, drones are looking in the windows of apartments with cameras, and people are expected to present their face to the window so that they can confirm that they're still at home. There are proposals, or it's actually being done in some countries, that patients have to have their phone, and when they receive pings at random times from the government, they have to take a selfie and transmit that selfie with a time and place stamp back to the government. So we are a hard no on these kinds of proposals. Fortunately, they have not been hitting the United States yet. Hawaii was thinking about requiring everyone who got off a plane and was told to quarantine for 2 weeks to engage in this, until fortunately their state's attorney general raised legal questions. So number three, we need to have a very high wall between data that is gathered about people for public health on the one hand, and the operations of law enforcement and immigration enforcement and intelligence agencies on the other hand. So we were very troubled a few weeks ago when Minnesota's public safety director analogized that state's attempts to identify protesters who were accused of arson and other crimes by interrogating people who'd been arrested to create social graphs on the one hand, to contact tracing for purposes of COVID on the other hand. These simply are different categories that we need to keep separated. Law enforcement should not get the data being used for contact tracing. And so, for example, we strongly oppose the suggestion that police officers should be given lists of addresses of houses where someone has been infected. This has been suggested so that when officers arrive at a home with someone who's infected, they could take extra precautions. We think this is a very bad idea because it's stigmatizing, because the more people who have access to the information, the less it's controlled, and because officers should be taking universal precautions when they are interacting with the public. So again, we need to have no sharing of data gathered to fight COVID with law enforcement and immigration enforcement. Number four, we are opposed to immunity passports and a related idea that is sometimes being called verified credentials, which has to do with blockchain, and I will explain that. There is a vision of how we get out of the social distancing at home process that we've been in for a very long time, through a process of somehow identifying who is sick and who is ill, and conditioning entry to public spaces such as restaurants or workplaces or schools or parks on display of proof that you are not ill. And one of these would be the immunity passport, which could be paper or a digital token on your phone, which shows that you are immune. The other would be the verified credential that you again would show on your phone. That would be proof that you are not currently infectious. So we oppose and there's actually legislation in California, Assembly Bill 2004, which is trying to authorize and entrench the system of verified credentials that I've just described, in which EFF and ACLU and other privacy groups have been lobbying strongly against. It left the state assembly by a majority vote a week or two ago. We're hoping to kill it on the Senate side. And so we oppose these kinds of things for many reasons. Perhaps most importantly, we are sliding as a society towards a system of universal digital identification that we would have to display when we do anything: rent a hotel, buy something, pass through a door, go to a bar. And so we are alarmed at the idea that public places would require people to flash their phones to transmit a digital token in order to prove wellness to get through there. It habituates institutions to doing this. It habituates the general public to complying with this. Moreover, there's no reason to think these schemes would work. As to immunity, the World Health Organization has said that there is no scientific reason right now to believe that having been infected once gives you immunity from being infected a second time. And as to proving that you're not currently infectious, that could change very quickly. So if you had an infection, if on day one you took the test and you weren't infected and you get your token of non-infectiousness, the next day you get infected and be asymptomatic. And on the third day, you're still showing your token of health. So we are very much opposed to the verified credentials of medical tests and the immunity passports as being a part of how we get out of the lockdown. And to be perfectly clear, we all hate the lockdown. It's especially bad for lower income people for many reasons. But turning to this kind of phony technology solution is not the answer. Number 5, there are a lot of proposals to have tracking systems on our phones to detect who we are in contact with so that we can automate the contact tracing process. This is one of the most common proposals being laid out around the world. Some of it is very alarming. Some of it is less alarming and requires, I would say, a wary approach, but not one of a hard no. What contact tracing is a centuries-old process of trying to contain an outbreak by, when you identify someone as infected, interviewing them about who they've been in contact with and where they've been, and then talking to those people in turn and seeing if they're infected and carrying out the process. And as we stand right now, there are efforts by many states to build up very quickly large infrastructures of contact tracing, and that clearly is important. It also is expensive and cumbersome, and it can be slow. So there was an episode in the last month where one person caused an outbreak by bar hopping in Korea, and they ultimately identified hundreds of people who had been infected. And in order to do that, they had to interview many thousands of people. So it's a big undertaking. So we can sympathize with the desire to come up with the magical app that will solve this problem for us and very quickly identify who's been in contact with who and bypass this historical cumbersome approach. This idea carries great privacy concern. As soon as you are using digital devices to map where people have been and who they've been in contact with and store this information somewhere, you are playing with privacy fire because this information could be put to all kinds of nefarious uses, such as identifying who was at the protest and who was in contact with who at the protest and who was planning for the protest. So one has to take a very fine-grained approach to this problem of the automated contact tracking apps. There's a category that we are a hard no on, which is doing this with location data. That is to say, our phones are constantly interacting with the GPS system in the satellites and the cell site system, our phones being in contact with cell towers. And a problem with this is that it simply is not granular enough to show that two people were within 2 meters or 6 feet of each other. It is, however, sufficient to show whether you went to work, whether you went to the movies, whether you went to a hospital that performs abortions. Information that simply is nobody's business. And so when it comes to automated contact tracing with apps that are based on location, such as GPS and cell site location information, we are a hard no. Fortunately, in the United States, a more common idea is to try to do this not with location data, but with proximity data. There is an existing infrastructure called Bluetooth, in which all kinds of different devices are in communication with each other, such as our phones and our earbuds and all kinds of other things. And the system might be retrofitted in order to detect signal strength and thereby estimate whether two devices were within 6 feet of each other. So the theory goes, and if we do this, that if you download the app to do automated proximity tracking, your phone would constantly be announcing a kind of random token, and other people with the app would be recognizing it and keeping it. You, in turn, would be capturing other people's tokens. And then if somebody gets ill and is confirmed as being ill by a doctor, all of the tokens they sent out get sent to a shared server. And the system is set up so that automatically everyone with the app their app is constantly asking for the list of tokens from the central server and checking to see if there's a match between the central server list of ill people and the tokens that the particular user collected. And if there's a match, they get a notification that they might have been exposed with a recommendation to seek a test and to self-isolate until then. So this system, many things need to be said about it. Number one, it might not work. Nothing like this has ever been tried before. We see all kinds of reasons for doubt that it works, one of which is that it's going to be both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. It's going to think that two people were in contact when they were separated by a wall, and it's going to think people were not in contact when one of them didn't carry their phone with them or didn't download the app. In the United States, 1 in 5 people don't have a smartphone. Around the world, the rate of not having a smartphone is much higher. And so at best, any kind of system of apps like this is going to have to be an adjunct to the tried and tested methods of mass contact tracing of the manual and interview sort, as well as a lot of testing. One big division that is much talked of here is between a centralized system, which means that there's someone in the middle who can match the tokens to identifiable people. We're strongly against that. Many of the states are now developing these apps. We are not thrilled with them because they're doing location or because they're centralized. To their credit, Apple and Google have set up an API for these, which has a decentralized approach that is focused just on the proximity and not on location. So the final thing I want to say is that a lot of the government's response to COVID is to form partnerships with corporations. For example, websites that ask people their symptoms so that the website can direct them to testing, or the apps that I've just been describing, or the contact tracing, where corporations are being hired to set up the infrastructures to do the manual contact tracing. There's a lot of data floating around, and unfortunately, for a very long time, America has not had enough laws to protect people's data privacy. And the COVID crisis is really shining a spotlight on that, which is why around the country, including here in California and in Congress, there's been a lot of bills being filed that would create new data protections to ensure that corporations don't walk away with this data and start sending us ads with it, and that governments don't walk away with this data and start using it for law enforcement or whatever they are doing with it. So the watchword needs to be data minimization, that we collect as little information as we need. We keep it for the shortest period of time, which might be weeks. We only use it for COVID response, and we don't share it with anyone who's not part of that COVID response. So thanks everyone for attending this terrific event. Again, I'm very appreciative of Ethics in Tech for having us. If you are interested in what you're hearing, we have a lot more about this at EFF.org. If you want to help out, join our action alert system, and we'll send you pings when you need to call your legislators and tell them to support strong legislation to keep our COVID data locked down. Thank you very much.